anyone can cook. This is the message repeated over and over again in Pixar's Ratatouille. We interpret that message in many ways. For one thing, the phrase, anyone can cook, encourages us to broaden our idea of who's suited for what kind of activity. Similarly, the message reminds us that almost anyone can learn almost any trait with enough determination. If a rat can cook, then what might we be able to do? In the modern vernacular, when a person says, let him cook, it means to freely let a person do something they are good at. But if anyone can cook, does that mean we should let everyone cook? Let me present you with another quote. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. You are almost undoubtedly familiar with this quote. It comes from Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. The line has become an oft-repeated platitude divorced from its original context. In the play, the character Malvolio reads the line from a letter. In the context of the scene, Malvolio thinks he's having greatness thrust upon him. In reality, the character Maria is tricking Malvolio. Maria wrote Malvolio a letter under the name of another character, Olivia. The so-called Olivia implies that Malvolio will have greatness thrust upon him. In reality, the instructions Maria leaves in the letter will lower Malvolio's social status. Even though Shakespeare probably intended to lace the quote with irony, we take the phrase on its face nowadays. Look, I know we're barely into this video and I've already gone off on a weird tangent, but bear with me. Was Remy born a great chef, or did he have his great culinary skills thrust upon him? In part, both. He was born with a keen sense of smell that made him a whiz in the kitchen. Then he had greatness thrust upon him when he ended up in Gusteau's kitchen. But there's another way a person obtains greatness, isn't there? Some are born great, some have greatness thrust upon them, and others learn greatness. If you ask me, Remy did all three of those things. He was born with unique traits, he ended up in fortunate circumstances, and he learned from those around him. Let's shift gears for a second. Charles Dickens published the Pickwick Papers at 24 years old. Mary Shelley was 21 when she published Frankenstein. Her husband, Percy Shelley, published his first book of poetry at 18 years old. Susan Eloise Hinton was just 16 when she finished The Outsiders. She published the book 2 years later. These sound like the sorts of people who were born great. On the other side of the spectrum, Toni Morrison published her first book at 40 years old. Ian Fleming wrote his first James Bond novel at 44. Bram Stoker first published at 43 and wouldn't publish Dracula until age 50. Charles Bukowski didn't fully devote himself to writing until age 49. I'm not even a fan of Bukowski, but no one can deny his success. These writers probably sound like those who had greatness thrust upon them. But the fact of the matter is, no matter how much natural talent these folks were born with, all of them had some amount of learning to do. In his book, On Becoming a Novelist, John Gardner posits that anyone can be a novelist. Of course, that position comes with some caveats. Anyone can be a novelist, but will everyone be a novelist? Of course not. Not even everyone who wants to be a novelist will become a novelist. So what's the difference? How does someone become a novelist? What about you? You want to write a novel, don't you? Do you have what it takes? Why don't we find out together? Perhaps you're familiar with National Novel Writing Month. Every November, writers around the world band together and each individually try and write a full novel in just 1 month. Now, before we go any further, I want to emphasize, I do not support National Novel Writing Month as an organization for so many reasons. I won't get into everything here, but you can check out Savi's recent breakdown or D'Angelo Wallace's brief recap of the AI situation. But even though I don't support NaNoWriMo as an organization, I do quite like the idea of writing a novel in a month. The challenge of it piques my curiosity as someone who loves to write. Of course, if we want to write a novel in a month, we should probably understand what a novel is. Google's definition is about as succinct as it gets: a fictitious prose narrative of book length. But how long is a book-length narrative? Well, sources may vary. NaNoWriMo encourages participants to write 50,000 words in a month, and you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who thinks that 50,000 words doesn't constitute a novel. Now, if this video went according to plan, I probably titled it something along the lines of How to Write a Novel in Just 1 Month. Note that the title does not say How to Publish a Novel in a Month, or even How to Write a Good Novel in a Month. That's not what I did, and it's not what I'm teaching you to do. I'm going to show you how I wrote a novel in a month, and also give you some general advice about being a novelist. So first, let me start with this. As Gardner tells us in his book's introduction, writing a novel takes an immense amount of time. Even if you do write a novel in 1 month, that won't be the end of it. Gardner later explains, the serious novelist can seldom punch straight through, right from beginning to end, knock off a quick revision, and sell his book. The idea he's developing is too large for that, contains too many unmanageable elements, too many characters, each of whom the writer must not just create, but figure out, as we figure out peculiar people in real life, and then must present convincingly. And the story contains too many scenes, too many moments, each of which the writer must imagine and render with all the intensity and care of his being. I imagine if you clicked on this video, you probably have a novel you want to write, and if you don't mind me speaking on your behalf, you probably want it to be a good novel. While writing any novel is a challenge, writing a good novel takes even more time and effort. Of course, that time and effort doesn't go unrewarded, even if not monetarily. As Gardner puts it, it is far more satisfying to write well than simply to write well enough to get published. So why write anything in 30 days? Well, in theory, you're going to be writing anyway. Why not challenge yourself? Yeah, your first draft probably won't be good, but at least it will exist. You won't be able to truly judge your story until it's finished, and you can't finish it without a first draft. To quote Gardner one more time, one cannot judge in advance whether the idea of the story is worthwhile, because until one has finished writing the story, one does not know for sure what the idea is. And one cannot judge the style of a story on the basis of a first draft, because in a first draft, the style of the finished story does not yet exist. So if you've always wanted to write a novel, now's the time. The rough draft won't necessarily be good, but it'll be something that you produced. That was my thought process going into this video. You see, dear viewer, even though I love to write, and even though I've written novel-length projects before, I've never actually finished a full novel. If you're like me, you have no problem starting novels, but finishing a novel is the tricky part. So this time I was determined. I wouldn't just finish a novel, but I'd do it in a month. If you want to write a novel in 30 days, all you have to do is write 1,667 words each day. That's really all there is to it. If you just wanted to simply know how to write a novel in a month, you can click off this video now, because it's just 1,667 words per day. If you want some encouragement and insight, keep watching. So, over 1,600 words per day, but if you're like me and you prefer not to write on weekends, then it comes out to about 2,500 words each day. At first I thought 2,500 words per day would be easy. I mean, sometimes I write 1,000 words without realizing where the time goes. Oh, how wrong I was. For some of you, 1,600 words or 2,500 words might sound like a lot. For others, not so much. Either way, it's going to require drive. Remember how we talked about greatness? Some writers are naturally talented, that's true, but Gardner emphasizes something over and over again in his book. If you want to be a novelist, the most important thing is drive. And the fact is, anyone can develop drive. If I might expound upon Gardner's work a bit, I'd argue that he highlights 3 specific traits that are more valuable than all else to the novelist: originality, individuality, and empathy. The good news is, an aspiring novelist can develop all of these traits, provided they have the drive. So, how did this little experiment go for me? Let's take it week by week, starting with week 0. You can call this cheating if you want, but I really wouldn't think of it that way. I don't think anyone goes into National Novel Writing Month without a little bit of planning, so I had to know what I wanted to write. Fortunately, I had a bank of novel ideas, much like you probably do, dear viewer. That being said, I didn't want to overplan. Some useful advice I got this year was that overplanning actually discourages us from writing. When you plan your story too rigidly, you risk taking away the possibility of improvisation, which is one of the most enjoyable parts of writing. If there's one thing I love, it's genre, and by that I mean I love every kind of genre. So there's actually more than one thing I love. Look, forget it. What I mean to say is there are a lot of different stories I want to write. But to do it all in a month as seamlessly as possible, I decided the story would have to require minimal world building, minimal research, minimal characters, and easily memorized internal logic. Keep in mind, I'm just speaking for myself here. For some people, world building and unique inner workings and characters will be easy. For me, they are not. So ultimately, I just decided I should set the story in the modern day and make it realistic fiction. I had multiple realistic fiction ideas. The one I thought I could best treat as a novel was a contemporary romance. Initially, the idea was simple. We have one character who has low self-esteem and another character who has no confidence in their art. The 2 characters would meet, the artist would paint the non-artist, and romance would blossom from there. I had this idea for a really long time, but shortly before I decided to write it, it evolved even further. See, in the lead up to Deadpool and Wolverine, I decided to rewatch all the X-Men movies. During the watch party, I started to think about how grueling the makeup process must have been for Rebecca Romijn and later Jennifer Lawrence. As I pondered on the relationship between an actor and their makeup artist, I thought, wait, what if I just incorporated that into the novel? The artist wouldn't just be a painter, they'd be a makeup artist too. And the subject wouldn't just be anyone, they'd be an actor. So with some plans under my belt, some concrete, some not so much, I at least had a decent starting ground. Before going into week 1, I figured I would analyze my process in a rather non-critical manner. I decided I would keep a small document explaining my thoughts and feelings after each writing day. I would keep track of how much time it took me to write 2,500 words, and I would mark the location in which I wrote to see if there were any patterns. As a final note, I also wanted to see if I could write a novel on top of everything else I had going on. I wanted to prove to both myself and to you, the viewer, that anyone can start writing no matter how much else they have going on. How did that go? Well, you'll see. Week 1. On the first day, I realized I was out of my depth, not in terms of writing, but in terms of subject matter. See, I know a tiny bit about visual arts, but I know nothing about makeup artistry. Moreover, I don't really know much about being an actor, so my character's biggest character traits were somewhat foreign to me. So I had to do a bit of research, even though I was trying hard to avoid that before I started. But even from just watching a couple of YouTube videos, I felt a little more sure of myself. I did not become an expert, but I learned enough to start a first draft. By day 4, I realized that I was already forgetting some of the details I'd written about in the days prior. I was so concerned about keeping things straight, which is part of the reason why I chose the genre that I did, and already I was letting things slip. But it's fine, I just had to remind myself that this was only a first draft. It did not have to be perfect. Far from it. On day 5, my last day of week 1, I wrote at work for the first time. See, I work a customer service job at a recreation center. When things are slow, I can pull out my laptop and start writing. John Gardner has a lengthy section in his book about the jobs that a novelist might have. For Gardner, he actually seems against the idea of writing while doing anything else. I get that. For a lot of people, you do have to be in a certain headspace to write, and you really can't be interrupted. However, if you feel you can write while being distracted from time to time, I totally recommend a job that makes writing feasible. Brandon Sanderson, who you're no doubt familiar with, worked as a night auditor at a hotel, which let him write on the clock too. It's going to be different for each writer, you just have to figure out where and when works for you. Speaking of when, let's talk about time. My fastest time was day 4. I wrote 2,648 words in 65 minutes. But don't get too impressed. Just because I wrote quickly doesn't mean I wrote well. Still, I was happy to have anything on paper. My longest time was at work with 109 minutes. My average writing time each day was 85.2 minutes per session. By the end of the week, I'd written 12,609 words. I felt good, not exactly about the writing, but about my consistency. Week 2. I managed to keep up that consistency, but week 2 still presented unique challenges. I started to get in my head about a lot of different things. For one thing, and this is one of my biggest weaknesses as a writer, I couldn't help but feel that all the characters sounded the same. That sort of makes sense considering I was just trying to get anything down on paper. I didn't consider how to make them audibly or linguistically distinct from each other. In a similar vein, I started to become more and more aware of the various words I overuse. Even before writing the novel, I knew I used words like but and just far too much. I also started to notice that I made my characters laugh all the time. He laughed, she laughed, they laughed, etc. In some ways, this is sort of an inevitability. There are only so many ways to say a person laughed, and words like chortle, chuckle, or cackle do have certain connotations that the word laugh doesn't. I also started reading John Gardner's novel this week, which helped in some ways and detracted in others. It instilled more hope and confidence while also making me question a lot of the choices I made. Gardner talks a lot about cliches, and I couldn't help but notice those which I employed. Let's talk for a second about drive. I mentioned earlier that drive is the most important thing for a novelist, at least according to John Gardner. As he puts it, if the young would-be novelist is not in some way driven, he will never develop into a novelist. Most don't. For Gardner, drive manifests itself in 2 ways: time spent working on a novel and self-sufficiency. I shouldn't have to point out how much that makes sense, right? You can't write a novel without spending time on it, but you won't spend time on it if you can't push yourself to do so. As far as self-sufficiency goes, Gardner writes, by the nature of his work, it is important that one way or another the novelist learns to depend primarily on himself, not others. that he love without too much need and dependency, and look inward or towards some private standard for approval and support. That's not to say that a writer shouldn't have a support system or that you can't surround yourself with people who love you, but you have to recognize that no one else can do your writing for you. And why would you want that anyway? Sounds terribly unsatisfying. For more on that, watch Dan Olsen's video on the Mikkelsen twins. And don't fret, you can learn to be driven. It probably won't happen all at once, but if you're willing to just try and dedicate a little time each day, the pieces can fall into place, I promise you. Something rather interesting happened during week 2. I was feeling a little depressed, just the normal amount under late-stage capitalism, you know. But after writing, I felt a little better. I'm not sure if writing distracted me from feeling sad or if it genuinely improved my mood. Probably a combination of both, but it was honestly very rewarding. The feeling of sadness had me extremely unmotivated to start, but once I actually sat down and started writing, I began to feel better. It reminds me of this Gardner quote: "Almost no one mentions that for a certain kind of person, nothing is more joyful or satisfying than the life of a novelist. If not for its financial rewards, then for others." Week 2, I totaled 25,001 words, and I averaged about 90 minutes writing each day. That makes my average between the 2 weeks 87.6 minutes each session. As expected, when writing at home, I get things done quicker than at work. Remember though, speed isn't the ultimate goal, consistency is. Week 3. So week 3 started on September 16th, and it also ended on September 16th. I only wrote one day during week 3. There were multiple factors. For one thing, I actually moved into a new place on the 16th, so I was lucky to even get anything down that day, but my motivation dipped for other reasons too. One thing I neglected to mention is that I'm in graduate school right now studying creative writing. I'm in my first semester, and before working on my novel, I turned in my first packet to my advisor. The packet had about 37 pages of original writing. Now, my advisor was very kind to me, but he was also very frank. If I might quote my advisor, "I think a major barrier between the story and we, the reader, is, and I'm sorry to be blunt here, you, the author. I felt throughout that I was reading a short story by an author and not experiencing an event through the sensibilities of a human. There were simply too many self-conscious efforts to couch the language, to buffer the action, to nod at the reader with turns of phrase that simply signaled to us that we're reading something and not being someone. If you've seen my videos, you probably know this already, but my writing is wordy." This was all very helpful advice, don't get me wrong, but it was hard not to be a little discouraged. Being me, I couldn't help but catastrophize. Am I a bad writer? Will I ever learn how to streamline my writing? Is my advisor lying to me when he says positive things just to make me stay in the program? So my move, combined with the advice from my advisor, had me a little unmotivated to write. Nevertheless, I kept on. Let's take a moment and talk about individuality. Oftentimes when writing, I'm trying to make my writing sound like writing. I want it to sound like the books I love, and I don't think that's unique to me. Ironically, that actually sort of hinders my ability to write. As Gardner writes, "Many student writers seem unable to tell their own most important stories." Watching movies and TV, playing video games, and even reading other books can actually drain us of our individuality when it comes time to create for ourselves. I know that seems counterintuitive, and the solution isn't to stop reading. That would make you a worse writer. Gardner later writes 2 things. First, the beginning novelist can learn from his betters, but what he sees must be his own time and place. Second, the main accuracy required by a writer's art has to do with self-understanding. This doesn't mean you literally write about yourself, but it means that you must understand yourself. What is it you like? What interests you? What do you observe in the world around you? What makes you tick? Basically, when I find myself wondering what to include in a story, I now have this Gardner quote to think back on. It doesn't matter which particulars the writer selects. If he's smart, he'll simply select those details he'd most enjoy finding in a story by someone else. As you seek to understand yourself, you will know what to write, piece by piece. Week 4. On Sunday, September 22nd, I tried to do some catching up, but shortly after hitting 2,500 words, I just felt exhausted. I didn't know if that was normal because I hadn't tried writing more than 2,500 words up to that point. Nevertheless, I was sort of back on track. I didn't write anything on the 24th, but otherwise week 4 was arguably a success, even though I remained behind my goal. On September 25th, I got the chance to meet with my advisor over Zoom, so we could discuss my first packet. He said a lot to help motivate me. I told him about the novel I was writing on top of all my writing for school. He asked me if I thought about the novel even when I wasn't writing it. I said yes, and he told me that was a good sign. I told him about how I felt I was falling behind. He immediately shut down that line of thinking. He said something to the effect of, "Don't think you're falling behind. Everything you write is a plus." And that was a nice way of looking at it. My advisor, Brett, also told me about his experience starting his own MFA program. When he first started graduate school, he tried to imitate his favorite undergraduate professor. Once he started Writer's Workshop, his classmates tore him to pieces. As Brett described it, his writing was overflowing with unnecessary similes and metaphors, and it just came off as way too verbose. Verbosity hit close to home for me. By the end of the semester, Brett met with one of his professors. This instructor told him, "Brett, I see no reason why you shouldn't be in this program, but I also see no reason why you should." As you can imagine, that was pretty devastating to hear. He wanted to give up then and there, but his wife encouraged him to press on. Remember what I said earlier about support systems and people who love you? Anyway, Brett decided to start from square one. He changed everything about his style. He sat down and started writing a memory from his childhood. He wrote it exactly as he remembered it. No fluff, no verbosity, just memory. Even though it started as a short piece of memoir, it evolved. Brett came up with a fictional ending for the lived experience. He went on to fictionalize other details, and eventually, the story was published. Now, I don't tell you this to say you'll definitely get published. I can't even say as much for myself. But I'm saying improvement is always attainable. With that in mind, let's talk about originality. Originality is closely linked to individuality. The very idea of originality can be paralyzing. As Gardner writes, "Driven by the imperative, make it new, the novelist finds nothing he's written sufficiently original." As mentioned previously, our love of literature can negatively impact us when it comes to originality. If you've read a lot, you might think it's all been done before. Again, let me reemphasize, you shouldn't just stop reading. In fact, as you read more, you'll be able to avoid banality. Gardner puts it this way: "As a rule, the more closely one looks at the writer one admires, the more clearly one sees that his way can never be one's own." Of course, even though reading can tell you what your writing shouldn't be, reading alone can't wholly teach you originality. When an aspiring novelist finds himself paralyzed by the wish for originality, Gardner observes that he has failed to notice that originality is normally a quality achieved by diligence, not a natural condition. With originality's close ties to individuality, both come as a matter of time and diligence. Keeping individuality in mind, Gardner adds, "The noblest originality is not stylistic, but visionary and intellectual. The writer's accurate presentation of what he himself has seen, heard, thought, and felt." While writing my novel, I also started reading Fortune Smiles. In this short story collection, Sioux author Adam Johnson takes the perspective of his wife, a German prison warden, and a North Korean defector. Even though Johnson has never lived any of those lives, the stories still convey his interests, beliefs, and experiences. He injects his originality and individuality at once by simply writing about what fascinates him. My average writing time for week 4 was 114.8 minutes. You'll notice that's a pretty significant jump. Week 4 presented 2 of my longest times yet thanks to some busy work days. On day 2 of week 4, I finished up in 185 minutes, and on day 5, it took me 160 minutes to wrap up. But by the end of the week, I had 40,136 words, and that was pretty incredible. I'd never written so much in so little time. You might perhaps realize, however, that the title of this video is sort of a lie. I didn't write a novel in a month. Not one consecutive month anyway, but bear with me, I have more to say that might be of some use to you. Week 5. By the end of week 5, I reached 50,000 words, but there was just one problem. The book wasn't done yet. That fact struck me for a lot of reasons. For one thing, before I started this undertaking, I was worried I wouldn't even be able to sustain a story for over 50,000 words in the first place. I thought this whole thing would end up being a novella. So, on the one hand, I kind of impressed myself. On the other hand, I started to feel really self-conscious about the story. I want to be taken seriously as a writer. I mean, who doesn't want to be taken seriously in their chosen field, right? But as I got deeper into the story, I couldn't help but question, is this the kind of thing someone would read and, in response, think of me as a serious writer? I confided these sentiments to a friend who told me, not all books need to be profound, so even if it's not, which it probably is, that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. These feelings were sort of ironic because the book on the whole carries a message about self-esteem and self-confidence, so the irony was not lost on me. In a certain sense, I liked the characters I invented, but in another sense, they felt a little too much like me, and historically, I've always had a bit of trouble liking myself. With that in mind, let's talk a little bit about empathy. Scholastics are not enough for the novelist. As Gardner puts it, what one has to get, one way or another, is insight, not just knowledge, into personalities not visibly like one's own. What one needs is not the facts, but the feel of the person, not oneself. The mandate seems almost contradictory. First, the writer must understand themselves, only to obtain understanding for others just as well. As my advisor told me, the last person I need to hear from is me. You see, a reader doesn't enter a novel to hear from the author, not directly anyway. A reader enters a novel to hear from the characters. If the reader thinks they're hearing from the author, it shatters the illusion, which is the last thing a writer should want. You have to think of your characters as real people who are experiencing something. That's a gradual process. Gardner promises that through writing and revision, one gets the characters and their behavior clearer in one's head, gradually discovering deeper and deeper implications of the characters' problems and hopes. By understanding the characters' problems and hopes, a novelist knows what the characters might do, rather than how to puppeteer them. As Gardner put it, the false practitioner fools himself, manipulating characters instead of trying to understand them. This empathy isn't just for the novelist's characters, but also for the reader. When an author lets characters behave like real people, the author shows that he values the reader's time and attention. Ungenerous fiction is first and foremost fiction in which the writer is unwilling to take the reader as an equal partner. The author's drive fosters not only self-compassion, not only compassion toward their characters, but also compassion for the reader. The novelist will likely find that such compassion is not so different from subject to subject. By the end of week 5, I'd written 50,162 words and averaged 128.5 minutes of writing per session. Kind of interesting how the average just keeps going up. Taking all 5 weeks together, the average writing time was 104.6 minutes per session. Week 6. So, my journey finally came to an end. Over the course of 5 more non-consecutive days, I finally finished my novel. And even though the days were non-consecutive, I'm still lumping them in as 1 week shut up. On October 14th, with 61,024 words, my novel was over. I started on September 2nd and finished on October 14th, which isn't too shabby. Had I ended up writing 60,000 plus words anyway, I would have finished around October 3rd, so I didn't get too far behind in the end. And like my advisor said, the fact that I wrote anything is a plus. So, how do I feel about the book now that it's finished? Admittedly, I have mixed feelings. I won't lie, and I hope this doesn't sound conceited, but I do kind of like it. Sometimes while writing, I would go back to check for information, and I would end up getting a little enveloped in what I had written. And like I said, I don't mean to toot my own horn, but I think the fact that I enjoyed reading it speaks to something inside of me. Now, is it a perfect novel? No, far from it. I mean, no novel can truly be perfect, at least I don't think so. But what I mean to say is, it's riddled with errors. There are hanging threads that I'd like to pull further in subsequent drafts, and there are plenty of things that just straight up need to be deleted or changed entirely. As with all of my writing, wordiness is a huge issue. And just because I like portions of it doesn't mean that anyone else would. Also, I wrote the book as a romance, but I question whether the romantic elements are even that strong. Like, do the main characters even have legitimate reasons that they like each other? Do they flirt well? I don't know. Will I continue this novel? I'm not sure. Perhaps I'll keep fine-tuning it, even though I do have mixed feelings about it. But am I glad that I wrote it? 100%. This is an idea I've had for a long time, and to see how it evolved once on paper, it was just really cool. Now, was I able to write the novel while keeping up with everything else in my life? Well, you can look back at my YouTube channel from September to October and find your answer. That said, I did manage to keep up with my day jobs, school, and my family and friends. I'm sorry that my time doing YouTube sort of suffered as a result. I kind of rationalized things in my head by saying that the novel was all leading up to a YouTube video, but even still, I had other videos I wanted to make that I had to put on the back burner. I'm sorry about that. Week 6 was my longest writing week by far, in no small part thanks to distractions at work. I averaged 147.4 minutes per session. My longest session ever happened in week 6 at 222 minutes. Yeesh. Taking all the weeks together, I averaged 113.18 minutes per session, but to get a full picture of how much time I actually spent on the novel, I added up every session together. If I've done my math right, I spent 2,652 minutes writing this novel. That's a little over 44 hours. So if I were to just shotgun Red Bulls and stay at my computer and write, I could have got this done in 2 straight days. But why would I do that? I'm not totally convinced of the book's quality in the first place, but I'm almost certain it would be even worse if I'd tried to do it all in one sitting. Of course, I can't say for sure. If I were to do a more in-depth analysis, I might be able to tell you which sections of the book were best and which locations were most conducive to good writing, but I can't really judge the quality of my writing in that way. I'm too close to the situation to give a perspective like that. But here are some things I can tell you. For one, I think I write better when I have instrumental music playing. For me, that's usually video game track covers. As for other factors of length, the novel ended up being 210 double-spaced pages long. Remember those words that I told you I overuse? The word but appears 476 times in the book. Granted, that's just using Control F, so it might be that it's counting words like butter, but still, the word just appears 374 times in the book. And these are only 2 of the words I know I overuse. Can you imagine how many words there might be that go right under my nose? Still, it's just a first draft. I started reading another book toward the end of my novel writing process. It's called Several Short Sentences About Writing by Verlyn Klinkenborg. This book suggests a much more methodical and purposeful approach to writing than what I'm talking about here. I was focused on writing a lot in a short amount of time. For Klinkenborg, good writing comes from taking a lot of time on just one sentence, which is fair, by the way. I'm not saying his approach is wrong. I'm not necessarily saying my approach is right either. Either approach is going to require editing. That's an inescapable part of the process. But which method might require less editing? Obviously, it'll be case by case, but I'd argue that Klinkenborg's approach will produce better writing in a single session. You just might come out with less total writing in that session. Both Gardner's book and Klinkenborg's book are must-reads, in my opinion. And speaking of Gardner's book, let's finish by talking about that one more time. Throughout this video, I've talked about traits that a novelist must have: individuality, originality, and empathy. All qualities that develop according to an author's drive. Of course, if your goal is simply to develop individuality, originality, and empathy, writing isn't the only way to do that. So why write? It's not like writing gets easier the more you do it. Once you get better at writing, you'll just start challenging yourself more, so the difficulty won't really feel like it varies. Even Gardner, after 20 published books, would ask himself if he truly was a writer. These facts again prompt the question, why write? In my experience, I chose writing, but writing chose me too. I can't help but write. And just as Gardner says, writing well is far more satisfying than writing well enough to get published. For all of writing's hardships, Gardner knows the truth. Almost no one mentions that for a certain kind of person, nothing is more joyful or satisfying than the life of a novelist. If not for its financial rewards, then for others. That's the second time I've shared that Gardner quote, but I just can't help emphasizing it. It's true. Writing is a joy. For me, not for anyone and everyone. I think there's really only one way for me to end this video, and that's to share. I'm going to make my novel available to read. Like I said, it is far from perfect, but I think it's only fair that I share the fruits of my labor. I want to emphasize that if I can do this, so can you. So you can take a look at the novel for yourself. It's linked down in the description. You can see that even though it's not perfect, it's on paper. It's a starting point. It's something that you can achieve too. Anyone can cook. And remember what I said earlier, every great novel started as a rough draft. But hey, before you go, take a look at this poem. This is titled A Flower Wilted by one of my patrons, M.E. A flower wilted is a man's gain, his pleasure, his little pride and joy, especially when he waters it. Thousands of us lay wilted in a field of dried petals, of moldering stems, of stepped-on thorns and leaves stained. Some of us were caught in a heavy rain, while others had been plucked by hand. Me, I don't quite remember, I forgot. I was once beautiful before my petals shriveled and rotted to a dusty brown from being watered again and again. And yet he delights in my decay, for a flower wilted is a man's gain. For the chance to see one of your pieces at the end of my videos, you can support me on Patreon too. Here are all the patrons who have helped to make videos like this possible. Thank you guys so much. I genuinely cannot express my thanks enough. You can support the channel in other important ways by doing all the things the algorithm likes, Also, feel free to follow me on my socials, and maybe one day I'll get back to posting regularly over there. Thanks for watching, and keep in mind, ultimately, this is a rough draft.